Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. It's a thrill and a pleasure to be starting our new online seminars at the Eisler Hochschule in Berlin. Conceptually and in our thoughts, we are in the Eisler space, though everybody is in different spaces in this strange time in the world. But it's wonderful to have the incredible musician, harpsichordist, forte pianist, pianist, but most importantly, a great musician, Andreas Staier, who has kindly agreed to present not one, but 3 seminars and share his thoughts on William Byrd today and the music of the Renaissance. And just a couple organizational things. I can see all of you, and we have a wonderful turnout. And I can see you. You can type in the chat. I'll monitor it for questions. You can raise the hand in the Zoom software. And Andreas has said that we can take questions during the seminar and also, of course, at the end. And some of you we can also bring up on video, and then it can be more of a real life presence and chat with Andreas. So I shut up and I turn everything over to Andreas.
So, hello everybody. It's a thing I have never done before, talking to my computer. Let's see how it feels. When Kirill asked me if I wanted to give some lectures and if yes, what to talk about, I thought maybe it would be a good idea to talk about also repertoire you might not know so well. And I thought it might be interesting for every piano player to have some idea of the very beginning of keyboard music. Obviously not the beginning of keyboard music, but the beginning of an independent, autonomous, secular keyboard music, which happened in the second half of the 16th century. Obviously, organ had been played in church, liturgical organ music for a long time. So it's not the beginning of keyboard music, but it is really the beginning we see in the later 16th century of the keyboard music, which is no longer just simple dance music or, as I said, organ music used in the church service. I think there are 2 reasons why this happened first in England. We are so used to see England as the country without much of its own music that we forget it was not always like this. The first reason, I guess, is sociological. England had colonies already, was already in the 16th century much richer than all countries on the continent, had already a sort of proto-bourgeoisie, quite in the sense in which you can speak of a bourgeoisie in continental Europe only starting in the 18th century. Bourgeoisie meaning a class with sufficient means to, for instance, also do house music. Actually, interestingly enough, the main genres of English bourgeois chamber music are quite the same as chamber music was in the 19th century. It's mainly about keyboard music, and what was string quartet in the 19th century is gamba consort, most often for 5 parts, but sometimes also less, in Elizabethan England. And so that first reason, that a layer of society had means to and leisure enough to do music at home, created a market for chamber music. And Byrd is actually the first of the really great composers who composed a substantial amount of his output for chamber music. Before that had never happened. Famous composers were writing Catholic masses and motets, Latin Catholic church music. So Byrd was the first large-scale creator of keyboard solo music and chamber music. Why? That brings me to the second reason, which is political rather than sociological. Byrd lived as a Catholic in the middle of the Puritan Revolution in England, and he had a dangerous life and a complicated life, politically speaking. He just could not have written representative church music to large extent because the Catholicism was prohibited. I will come back to this second reason. What does it mean for the development of music? What does it mean in the particular case of William Byrd? What did it mean? How did it feel like being Catholic in Puritan England? I will come back to this a bit later. Let's first have a look at the first piece I wanted to speak about, The Woods So Wild, which shows actually quite nicely, it can even be taken as a metaphor for the rise of sophisticated keyboard music out of popular music. You can, in a certain way, look at this piece as a piece which shows somehow in a very nice way, in an exemplary way, something which in the beginning seems to be simple and popular and then gradually develops into a quite sophisticated composition. In the beginning, you might think it's just a simple dance or a popular tune. It might last for 32 bars or so, but then much more happens, and it's an accumulation of events. So let's take this piece as an example of, as an image of the creation of a large, rather large scale. I mean, it's not large scale in the sense of 19th century, but it's definitely quite large scale for an individual keyboard piece, which does not rely on religious cantus firmus or anything else. So let's have a look at The Woods So Wild. Just before we go a little bit into detail, a brief overview of the form. Unfortunately, in this source, the numbers of the strophes are incomplete, so it would obviously start in the beginning with the number 1, and then you see number 2 beginning of the second line, etc., etc. Number 3 and 4 for some reason are there, and then the numbers get lost. In the whole, on the whole, it has 12 parts, 12 times the melody. There is, but this is not for our meeting now, it's not important. There is another source which has 40 variations instead of 12, but let's stick to this one, to this version with 12 variations. If we have just a very global look, we can see, so in the beginning, obviously, there's the theme quite simple. The first 7 variations gradually speed up. which is what variations usually do. Variation 8, which starts on page 146, second line from the bottom, comes back to a more calm movement, bigger note values, and then there is a second wave of acceleration, so to say, until the very last variation, which stands out by being quite surprisingly different from what we have seen or heard before. So this is just an overview. You can see somehow two waves of acceleration. The first 7 variations, then variation 8 to 11, and a final summary, apotheose, or however you might call it. Let's have a look at the melody itself. Let's go back to the beginning. So, popular tune, very English indeed. English melodies often have a particular liking for the interval of the 6. Also, typically English is a certain dual tonality. You see 2 bars in F major, 2 bars in G, 2 bars F major, and then a cadence in G. So we might, in our modern tonal language, we don't really know what this piece is in. Is it in F major, a piece in F, or is it a piece in G? It's actually both. We have quite a number of melodies in England which do that, which seem to have 2 tonal centers. We will see in Walsingham, it's also structurally a little bit similar. So if we look at the beginning, we see it couldn't be simpler. We have the melody in the right hand, and the left hand does a sort of bagpipe accompaniment. First bar with just 1 2 1 2, and then it gets sort of regular. This is as simple as it is. It has consequences in the piece. At first, we hear the melody and the accompaniment being in complementary rhythm, so we don't really know if what looks like a syncopation is actually a syncopation or just sort of an arpeggio going up from the bass towards the melody on on the 3rd quarter note. So first 4 bars are completely simple, just a bagpipe accompaniment. Second half of the theme, which is, except for the ending, identical to the first half, is already slightly different. We see that the bass starts to join to the melody a 3rd or a 10th lower, so gradually melodic linear elements are introduced. And we see also, if we now go to the 2nd variation, that what started in the bass in the 2nd half of the 1st variation is taken up and continued in the 2nd variation 1 octave higher. So the bass motive comes in the 2nd variation. And that is something which, as simple as it looks, is a very important means to create a coherency in the piece. We have this theme which is entirely charming and popular, but which is very square. It is very somehow in blocks of 2 bars, F, G, F, G. So the compositional problem to write a long series of variations is, of course, or one of the compositional questions to worry about is how can we avoid that it is too much in compartments. What Byrd does, and not only in this particular piece, but in many variation sets written on popular tunes, he liquidifies, I don't even know if this word exists, verflüssigen. He tries to bridge phrases or caesuras between variations by introducing a new device, a new idea, a new counterpoint towards the end of one variation, and that then starts to flourish in the next variation. So we have a particular way of avoiding right angle edges, so to say. So the second variation continues exactly where the first stopped. Again, in the second half of the second variation, that would be so third line from the top, he introduces a new little counterpoint. You can't really call it new because it comes in as a sort of consequence out of the melody. I speak of the second bar. Yes, exactly. And plays a bit around with it. Then, after he has bridged, so to say, the first and the second variation, there is slightly more of a caesura before the third one. It returns to a very simple pattern, quite like the very beginning. It's like a new beginning, but not completely like the beginning, because he superimposes a higher treble voice on top of the melody, which sounds like just part of the accompaniment in the beginning. And then in the second half of this number 3, it starts developing a life of its own. And that is a little syncopated motive, beginning of the bottom line of this page. And then we see, okay, the syncopations actually, they make us think of the very beginning of the piece, what the left hand does. And so it's a little, I don't know, a little germ which causes an infection, I shouldn't say in these days, but there's this little play with a syncopation, which obviously comes out of the theme, although we didn't, or maybe just subconsciously noticed that there is a syncopated element at the very beginning of the piece. So the other little element, I speak still of the bottom line of the first page, is what comes in the second bar. After the syncopation in the treble, we have yum badum beam, which obviously is we have seen this rhythm already in the number 2, in the first. Sorry, we have seen this rhythm, of course, in the theme itself, in the third bar. Yum badum be. So he starts playing around with these two motives: the syncopated one of the first bar of the bottom line, and then the dotted one in the second bar, which is what he continues doing in variation 4. Then he, for a moment, the syncopations go away, but the canary, like yum, no, actually they don't go away, because there is yum, he combines both of them. again, you can see that by that he links the variations number 3 and 4 closely together, because he prepares the material of variation 4 already in the second half of variation 3. So again, it's the process of linking something closely in order to avoid too schematic repetitiveness of just blocks. One variation does this, the next variation does that. In comparison to, let's say, a late Baroque series of variations, or even a Mozart series of variations, it's much less regular, what you see here, much more spontaneous, and actually, you might call it more sophisticated, because the stereotype limits between one variation and the next one are somehow avoided, bridged. I will not go on, don't be in panic, I will not go on in the same slowness and detail forever. I will leave it to you. What we can see, variation 5, which starts page 145, second line in the middle, using again the rhythm and creating, that's also interesting, maybe I should mention that, prolonging it. Now we don't have motives which last one bar, the way we had in variation 4. Now he prolongs it and puts a little canon. First bar, the treble has the new motive in variation 5. Second bar, the tenor repeats it. Gradually, is it clear still, Kirill, where I am, what I talk about?
Absolutely.
Okay, fine. Because I see your mouse and it's somehow somewhere else, but I should.
Sometimes because of the computer operations, but
no problem. No problem.
I think
we're okay. If you think I'm getting too, it's not clear, please interrupt me. So let's have a look a little bit more quickly. What we see in variation 6, gradually he keeps things running. He ends up in a practically through-going chain of 8 note movement. So that's the end of the first acceleration development from the beginning until the end of variation 7. Then this is the middle axis, so to say, not exactly at the center. In some other cycles, it is exactly at the center. Here it's maybe goldener Schnitt, maybe it's a bit behind after the center. He starts new, something different, calm again, only quarter notes, no 8 notes left. So it's quite a strong contrast. Reminding us again with this turning round, sort of reminding us again of the bagpipe beginning, in a slightly different version, which then the second acceleration process is starting in variation 9 with all sorts of, I would think, scherzando counterpoints. Variation 9 starts in second bar of 147. Yeah, exactly there. So we have these counterpoints, and that's a speciality of Byrd, a speciality of which I'm enormously fond, that he has this means of creativity of finding counterpoints which are rhythmically so alive, because they always have some sort of offbeat syncopation value, which somehow there are metrical collisions. We will see more of them in the fantasy when we come to the A minor fantasy. But here also the ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum. You can wonder where's, first of all, it's the motive is in 2 and not in 3, so it collides with a metrical schedule. We can with a metrical system. And is it an upbeat figure, ba-da-dim, ba-da-dim, ba-da-dum, or is it ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum? Don't know. And I think the charm of it is that he plays around and everything goes so fast that we can just, what is it exactly what we hear? Is it off? Yeah, is it an upbeat or is it a downbeat figure? I don't know. Same game in faster, I mean, more eighth notes in the next variation, exactly there. It starts ba-da-da-da-dee-da-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-dee-da-da-da-dum, and then third bar, he repeats it more often. There is not yum ba-da-da-da-dum, but yabba-da-da-dee-da-da-da-dee-da-da-da-da-da-dee-da-dee-da-da. So there is an acceleration as if someone is falling, I mean, stumbling over his or her own feet. This is another thing I'm very fond of in Byrd music. We have, of course, millions of variations in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, which then somehow gradually go from a more calm movement to through going 8th notes or 16th notes. He has a way of, his figurations are always rhythmically extremely alive. There's hardly any stereotyped figuration which just goes automatically. There's always a rhythmical element which makes us smile because it's highlighting the weak beats instead of the strong beats. It's asymmetric. It doesn't seem to fit entirely in what we would expect, etc., etc. So very nice. If you play this particular variation number, which is number 10. No, the one on page 147 still. Exactly. No, the one before still. You are faster than I. Yeah, exactly that one. You will feel that the third bar makes you stumble yourself. So it's somehow a nice thing. Make players stumble. So variation 11, I'll try to be short. Again, the canary, the motive we have already heard in, I think it's the 4th variation, to quite towards the beginning, and then ending of in 8th notes. And now we come to the last variation, and actually that is, in my opinion, something very remarkable. You remember the beginning, which was quite similar. Yeah, okay, just look at the first bar of yes, and go back to the very last variation, please. One more page. Yeah, exactly. So the first bar does exactly what the beginning has done. So it is coming back towards the beginning, but then from the second bar, some completely new things happen. You might remember, I mean, it would be, of course, much nicer to hear the piece in its entirety. You might remember the melody was nearly always harmonized on like an organ point F major. So the D on the second bar of the melody, yum dum dee 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 dee, was usually harmonized as an appoggiatura Vorhalt to going towards the C. So it didn't have its proper harmony. It basically stayed in F major, and first instead of C, there was first a D, which then resolved into the C. Here we have, for the very first time in the piece, we have a complete harmonization of these 3 notes and some after having heard this piece, which is so much based on harmonic or ostinato, this cadence feels like as if we have never heard a cadence in our lives. He has never done so far given each melodic note its own harmony. He has never done so far a cadence in F major. All we have heard so far are cadences in G major at the end of each variation. So first bar of this last variation was a remembrance of the beginning, so to round the cycle off. Second bar shows us, no, actually, after having heard all of this, we are on a completely different level. And then what he does with the melody, he writes quite sophisticated harmonic tissue voice leading like a choir in 4 parts. Suddenly he makes this popular melody sound like a motet sung by a choir. The harmonic richness corresponds with the richness in voices. The voice number was handled very freely before, and now we have a quite consistent writing in 4 parts. And as I said, I wanted to highlight certain aspects of this work which could be seen like a metaphor for, I take a popular tune and I turn it into something very sophisticated. So a metaphor for the very process of invention of a highly sophisticated, independent, secular keyboard music. And that piece is a good example because at the same time he manages to lead us back to the beginning in this final variation, but he makes it very clear that we are not back to the beginning, like we might be back to the beginning in Bach's Goldberg variations, when at the very end the aria comes back completely unchanged. Here, it's not unchanged at all. It's only the first bar, and then he writes a choral apotheosis to a piece which would never have us made expect something like this. So it is actually, in a certain way, a very interesting tour de force.
And I have a question for you. The appearance of more tonal harmony versus the more modal and folk-like beginning. Do you think the fact that he harmonizes it more at the end is a certain comment on tonality being considered a more sophisticated way of operating in his time? The fact that he harmonizes this with a full cadence.
No, I don't think so, because such a cadence, I mean, we have modes. If you would associate this to a mode, it's actually not without problems. You could only call it mixolydian because it finishes in G, but it does not, except for the final cadence where leading notes were always allowed to be sharpened. It never has an F sharp in its structure. So it's always F. So it can only be mixolydian, but mixolydian, the final cadence, just the cadence is the same. There is no difference between a mixolydian cadence or that cadence. You point out now the F major cadence is perfectly possible in a modal context. So I don't think this can be seen as, I showed you now that we are heading for tonality. Anyway, he could not have any idea that it was going towards tonality. But such a cadence is no contradiction to a modal structure. But interestingly enough, maybe actually, to come back to your question, it is the opposite, that if you look through, like for instance, Fitzwilliam Virginal Book, the pieces which seem to be most modern in terms of major minor tonality are actually the simple dance pieces, and the more sophisticated you get, the more modal it still is. So I think surely we could not associate modern tonality being regarded as something new and modern and ambitious in those times. The simple dances seem to be just already in minor or major, but the longer pieces have much more modal elements in it. So I don't think this is a journey towards tonality. No, not really. So, anyway, neither in our modern tonal system nor in the modal system, this melody can be somehow put into a drawer and labeled, because there is no mode which alternates between F and G and F and G. This is the speciality of this particular tune. So, oh yeah, time is running.
Well, we are, this is the internet, so we're not in a hurry, and we are in fact not losing people who can now vanish into thin air much easier on the internet. But in fact, I think we are wrapped in attention.
Okay, let's hope so. Let's go to Walsingham. Before I come to Walsingham, I will try to be short. I will give you a few biographical informations about Byrd, because they, as I already said, when I said he's the first composer for whom chamber music is an important part of his output, and that was not maybe an aesthetical choice, but he didn't have any other choice, because he was living as a Catholic, so in a potentially very dangerous situation in the middle of the most horrendous Puritan hysteria in England. And I wanted to give you a few informations about that. So you all know that Henry VIII was not allowed to divorce from one of his wives, and by the Pope, which made him furious. That's the simple way to tell a very complicated story. In fact, it was, of course, England was economically powerful enough to no longer let anybody else tell England what it had to do. So England separated from Catholicism, and in an extremely bloody and drastic way. Everything was discarded what smelled even remotely of Catholicism. So Catholicism was, of course, the old religion with a lot of traditions, and with traditions of interpretation of what a certain chapter in the Bible meant. The priests were the professionals to explain the Holy Scripture to the layman. All this was thrown overboard by the early Protestants. They wanted to go back to the roots. Let's not allow anybody interpret the Holy Scriptures. Let's read it ourselves. And that is a very interesting thing to think about. I mean, since the famous sociologist Max Weber in the early 20th century, one of the virtues of Protestantism was always said to be they established alphabetization of the population much, much earlier than the Catholic countries, which is true. which had been true until the early 20th century. The percentage of people who could read and write was always much, much higher in Protestant countries than in Catholic countries. So that was seen as a big step ahead in civilization, which in a way, of course, it is. But the problem when you try to go back to the roots, everybody reads the Holy Scripture. What they, of course, did not somehow take into account, the Bible is a conglomerate of texts by completely different people, written in different surroundings, in different languages, and it's by chance that a certain chapter ended in a certain form in the Bible. So it was, of course, a mission impossible. You read the Bible, you will understand it. In the Puritan rage, then, being able to read was a very, very dangerous thing, because if you read yourself and you understood something wrong, you were accused of heresy. So reading was extremely dangerous. And to give you just one example of the follies of the fetishism of word, you say to someone, I'm sorry. So what you do by that is you show repentance, but you might also show penitence. In German, it's the same word, Reue. Es tut mir leid, ich bin reuig. If you said, I show repentance, it was all right, but penitence was Catholic, and that shortened your life considerably. So it came to absurd exaggerations. It was a bit like Moscow 1937, I guess, that there was everybody denouncing, was told to to denounce everybody else. Catholics were checked if they went to church every Sunday. If not, they had to pay a lot of money. They could end up in jail. It happened regularly to Byrd that he had to pay large amounts of money because he didn't attend Anglican service as a Catholic. They searched his house on many occasions in search of forbidden books. Of course, they destroyed the organs, because organ playing was not mentioned in the Bible. Nothing which was not mentioned in the Bible was supposed to happen in relation to religion. So it was a horrible situation. Byrd must have had many compromises to do, but he had somehow, first of all, he was famous enough that he somehow was to a certain extent untouchable. And of course, he was not the only hidden Catholic in England, especially among the higher aristocracy. You had lots of lords who had their private Catholic chapel at home, and it was in secret that they still practice the old faith, the old Catholic faith. If you look at those people, they are nearly to 100% the dedicatees of Byrd's works. It's the Catholic, the hidden Catholic mafia, so to say, of England. Fortunately for him, Elizabeth I didn't really mind him being Catholic because he was a good musician. For her, the quality of her chapel royal was more important than if people were Catholic or not, as long as the political situation, of course, remained stable. So she once, that's an often quoted sentence, she said, yeah, he is a stiff papist from Pope, Catholic, but he is a loyal subject. So he managed somehow to survive, but he had to do quite a lot of things undercover. He composed 3 masses, very probably for one nobleman who was also a crypto-Catholic, to be performed at home. That means also they are surely for tiny choirs, not for large choirs, because it had to be at home. They were published, which was a very risky enterprise in those days, without a title page. So there was something completely different on the front page, and in between, and in the book itself, it was the Catholic masses of Byrd. So a dangerous enterprise, but somehow hidden. And that is why I wanted to talk a little bit about this, because Walsingham, the variations, are actually a good example of this undercover activity which Byrd was forced to lead. There are two, first I have to shortly tell you what Walsingham was. Walsingham was the most prominent pilgrimage place in England. It was like Lourdes in France. Big attraction, and it was especially a place of veneration for the Virgin Mary. And obviously the Virgin Mary is the very symbol of Catholicism, because there is not much about the Virgin Mary in the Bible. So Protestants were violently against adoration of the Virgin. Therefore, Walsingham Abbey, which was in Norfolk, not far from Lincoln, was destroyed in the 1530s. And that came as a big shock to the English Catholics. And there were many comments on this brutal destruction of a splendid and extremely huge abbey, among which two poems which you might read afterwards. I will just briefly summarize them. Yeah, exactly. That's what still is left of Walsingham Abbey. Thank you. I didn't even ask for this picture, but it's very nice. So there are two poems. There are much more actually, but two poems show something quite interesting. One poem is a love story between two pilgrims on their way, and exactly. That's the first poem, the love story. As you came from the holy land of Walsingham, met you not with my true love, etc., etc. We don't have to read all of that. It's a love story, and the true love, the girl with fair hair and blue eyes, she finally ran away. Such an angelic face, like a queen, like a nymph, etc., etc. So it's not the quality of the poem which is of interest here. So it's a love story. There is then a very, very different poem on Walsingham, which the other one, in the rags of Walsingham, whom should I choose but the Queen of Walsingham? The Queen is, of course, the Virgin Mary, to be by a guide to my muse. And then the fourth strophe, bitter was it, oh, to view the sacred vine, while the gardeners played all close, rooted up by the swine. So the wine is taken out by swine, by pigs. Very violent accusation, Protestants being pigs. It's a dangerous poem. 10th strophe, weep, weep, O Walsingham, whose days are nights, blessings turned into blasphemies, holy deeds to despise. So it is a bitter complaint of the Catholic community against the destruction of this wonderful abbey. Coming back to Byrd undercover activities. So his, I think, largest, longest, and most important variation cycle for keyboard, for virginal, is Walsingham. And he took the title of Walsingham, and everybody could, of course, associate whatever he wanted. And if there were accusations, you are writing keyboard music which with Catholic associations, he could always say, no, 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 I was thinking about the love story and not about the other poem. So that might give you an illustration of the dangerous times he was living in and the sophistication with which he tried to somehow get around certain traps. Here, as there were two poems, he couldn't really be blamed because as it's not vocal music, you can't really prove things. But if we now turn to the beginning of the piece, the first thing which is striking, of course, is the melody is solo, no accompaniment for two bars, and then the big choir comes in for the next two bars, and then a thin soloistic continuation, bar 5 and 6, again answered by the choir. This is, of course, the very image of Catholic antiphon. You have the singer, the solo singer, and then the whole community answers in choir. So this antiphonal alternatim, that was the word alternatim, the alternating between solo singer, priest, and the whole community answering, is something eminently Catholic. So it already in the way he exposes the theme, he introduces the theme in the very first variation. No, variation not, but theme. But the English always count the theme as number one and not theme and then this first variation. So that's just to to be clear. So in number one, it couldn't be a more Catholic beginning. So everybody who wanted to know knew exactly what the poetic background was, that it was not about a love story, and the whole piece is extremely melancholic, which you will immediately perceive when you play it through, and it starts like music in a Catholic service. So I will try to speed up a little bit. Short formal overview, you don't have to jump between all the pages because there are too many of them, so just relax, Kirill. It's again similar to What's So Wild on a much larger scale, 22 variations, which of course correspond to the 11 stanzas of each poem. They both fortunately had the same number of 11 strophes. So 22 makes us immediately think there is a relation between this variation cycle. Two variations make one poetic strophe. Again, here we have two waves of accelerations. Variation 1 to 7. And then there is again, much more pronounced here than in What's So Wild, variation 8. Sorry, no, I'm completely avoiding a moment. It's not variation. The first 10 variations are getting faster. And then variation 11 and 13 are like the eye of the cyclone, the calm center, which frame a slightly more fast variation 12. So 11, 13, being around variation 12 is somehow the epicenter of the variation cycle. Then again, there is a second phase of acceleration, even faster, because he introduces 16th notes, as you can see in variation 15, and virtuose figuration runs in thirds in the left hand. And then comes a tripla. Just at the end of this page, suddenly then there is a triolic the very last bar starts the tripla. It's not written here exactly that bar, so that's another acceleration until the big apotheosis towards the end, which comes in two different stages. You see, the acceleration process comes to an end with variation 17, and the last four variations, 18, 19, 20, no, the last five even. I have to look at the music also on my iPad. So the last variations from 18 to 22 are doing something different. They are doing, let's say, approximately what the very last variation in Wood So Wild did. They are again vocal, not virtuose. They behave like a 4-part, sometimes even 5-part choir. So this is the overview. It is analogous. A long stretch of this is like 9 minutes or so. A long stretch of variations is grouped and clearly articulated in the middle of the cycle. As I wanted to save time, I will just tell you, you can look more closely if you feel like in the music yourself. The first process of acceleration is actually very closely linked to the cantus firmus, to the melody pretext. You can see on the lower part of the first page, if you look at the melody, ya da dee dee dee. So these da da dee, this rhythm is used in constantly in variation 3, in variation 4. It is, maybe that's another sign of respect to this important melody, important for Catholics. He pays a lot of respect to it, so to say, because it's he identifies with it, he treats it with great care, he derives most of the motives quite directly out of the theme, until the middle axis, which we reach, as I said, in variation 11. And the second acceleration process, that is different. So he doesn't do twice the same. The second is then actually much more instrumental with the virtuose thirds in the left hand of variation 14, and then 16th notes in 15, and then the triplet. So that is not twice the same, but it is adding something particular of somehow an idiomatic instrumental possibilities. And what I again would like to just point out to you, because I think for me it's a heartbreaking moment, is again here in a much more impressive, on a much more impressive scale, the harmonic events in the last culmination, when it sounds suddenly like choral music sung by a choir, which starts in variation 19. If we quickly, please, Kirill, go back to the first page. Beginning, you see, here we again have a bitonal, so to say, theme. It has two tonal centers. The first bars are a bit difficult the solo bars are a bit difficult to look at. At the end of the second bar, we realize actually first bar sounds more like B flat major. Second bar, then the last note tells us, or the last two notes tells us might be in G minor. Then choir answers B major. Then second half of melody, finally having a cadence in G major. So again, we have a theme like Wood So Wild, but with a very different character. A theme which has two tonal centers, B flat and G. And this is what that structure, what we hear in the whole series of variations, is this oscillation between B flat and G. And in a cadence leading to G minor or major, of course, you will hear as the dominant D major. So that is a harmony which we hear regularly reappearing. We also hear F major in bar 5 of the theme. That is, of course, F major. What other keys, other tonalities are basically not heard. Now let's turn to variation 19 and look at the last bar. It has a shining, really shining like the sun, C major, which never appeared before. And I think, as I suppose that you, being pianists, you are used to the harmonic complications of 19th century music much more than this. If you imagine somehow, if you wanted to do something special in a harmonically very rich language like the 19th century, you had to go to, of course, to some extremes to create something noticeable, to be remembered in strong means required. This music here is not, although the harmonic basis is much narrower, but that's not only being poorer, but that is also creating opportunities that you can use one chord in a similar way as we saw in the last variation of the Wood So Wild, where suddenly we hear for the first time in a long piece a cadence in F major, never heard before. It strikes our ears. So I think keep that in mind, that that is harmonic inventiveness and richness on a different level, but equally effective and equally thought on large scale. So Byrd is able with more restricted means to create as much large scale organization of forms than Mozart or whoever. So we have here this amazing climax at the end, leading in the last bar of variation 19, where should normally be G major, we have C major, a C major we have never heard in our lives, so it seems. Followed directly the bar afterwards, which is the first bar of variation 20, by a B major, which we have not heard in this explicit and 6-part position, 6 voices, B major with, for the low B flat being the first note of the theme, which is all the way low down in the bass. It is an amazing climax, and as I said, I find it heartbreaking. It also brings me to one aspect I will only just tell you, you can look it up for yourself. Just like in religious music, where you can see very clearly good composers have a regie, a control over
I think we seem to, or you have muted yourself or something. Oh, there we go. You're back.
Now I'm back.
We lost
How
for a second.
For how long did I disappear?
For just 3 seconds. So the good composers have a regie.
Yeah. So just if you can go through, I will not go into detail there. You can go through this piece and see how carefully he enlarges the sound extremes, the highest notes, the lowest. The theme, like in the very beginning, lowest note is G, and highest note is D. So it's just 2.5 octaves. And he stays there quite long. And then gradually he goes higher even higher. And the highest note of his keyboard is the high A, which you see in variation 19, exactly there. And he approaches the high A once or twice before, but each time he goes to the high E, it's high A, it's more emphatic. Same with the lowest notes. What you see in the beginning of variation 20, the low D being not only important because it's so low and it's a 6-part chord, but it is the cantus firmus, the theme itself, which for once is so low and going all the way down to the low D. So you see also in his treatment of voices and the high points, the low points of voices, in extremely careful overview and planning. And I will the most emphatic highest note is in the last variation number 22, where in the final cadence, it is, wait a moment, the final cadence of the last variation is third line from the bottom, second bar. Exactly that bar, yada dee. It has the emphasis of syncopation, and this variation is special in so far also that, not especially beautiful, I should rather say. It uses a procedure which Byrd is very fond of using for closing of movements. You see in that final variation, the cantus firmus, the melody is in the alto part. If you just point to first bar of 22, the melody is in the alto and stays in the alto, and on top of it is like an angel singing even higher, and then he sticks to the cantus firmus, but the new soprano is so incredibly expressive that it is really emotionally a very strong moment of farewell. I will not say more to this piece, and actually I wonder if we should leave the sort of analytical pieces, if we should limit ourselves to these two pieces, or if I should very briefly comment on the others. I don't know. Maybe it's also time to ask if
we can
someone
also, we
question or
we can even make up a question to our listeners if we may continue and hear you talk about the other two pieces and get a rough estimation. But I think we're not in a hurry, and I think a lot of us are. I'm getting some text messages saying that this is most interesting. There was a question from Professor Nebelsin about the 17th variation. What would be the way of playing 2 against 3 there? Would the right hand be dotted in order to be together with the triplet of the left hand?
Hello, Herr Professor Nebelsin. No, I don't think. I mean, those rhythmical interferences are happening a lot in Renaissance music. In Baroque music, they might be somehow synchronized. In Renaissance music, sort of, there are just different layers of metrical structure. The upper voice is untouched by the triplets. It doesn't know of them, so to say. I would certainly not synchronize. I would also not synchronize if you see the last, let's say the last bar of the next line, the second line of variation 17. It's just to be played as written, I'm pretty sure.
And I think we have a raised hand.
And maybe I will not go into detail. The double strokes you see so often in these scrolls, they are of course not what they mean in modern notation. They are ornament signs, and God only knows what exactly they could mean. They could mean trills. The most probable is they just tell you, please play an ornament here, but they are not meaning one particular ornament, but a variety.
And if I don't press something wrong, we have Professor Engel that also would like to say, I think I can do voice. Let's see what happens. I think now we should be able to hear Konrad.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Dear Mr. Staier, thank you so much for this enlightening words until here. I was very impressed to see, especially the first piece, especially how kind of Beethoven-like already this motivic progress was. Actually, my first question was answered right now about these abbreviations, these double strokes and stuff. Do you have a recommendation about something like a book telling me more about how you could go for these ornaments and stuff during this period?
Well, there is, as far as I know, there is a musicologist. The most intelligent articles I wrote, I read about it by an English musicologist whose name is Desmond Hunter. I mean, maybe I can write down and then I can share the literature. He wrote quite a lot and very intelligently on the question of.
If you tell the name of the article, I can search it and we can paste it.
There is one article which is ornaments in My Lady Neville's book, something like that. So it's quite specifically concerning William Byrd and Lady Neville's book. And then he wrote quite a number of articles. There's another article which serves as an interesting background information, about the strokes, sort of these oblique strokes and ornament signs in earlier music, first half of the 16th century. How it was used, he compares different sources, and some sources write ornaments in real notes, which other sources give like single or double strokes. So that is the basis of his argument, that he comparing different sources with different notational habits, that he comes to the conclusion it's not like in the French ornamentation system of François Couperin. You have one sign which means this ornament and the other sign means only that ornament. It allows a variety of ornaments. Maybe short trills would be the most often used, but you can also have cambiata figures. It might even, in some places where it can hardly be a trill, it can be also a sign for an arpeggio, might be, because sometimes you have final chords of phrases which carry multiple double strokes, and that probably can only mean arpeggio, because you can't really play trills on big chords. So it's a tricky question. It's not entirely clear, and there might be, of course, then also different usage by different composers and different usage by different scribes. Lady Neville's book is a very good source, because we know that it was copied under Byrd's supervision. Fitzwilliam Virginal Book is a much less reliable source, because the scribe was also a Catholic, and he spent some 20 years in prison and spent his time copying music, but he didn't have access to the best sources always. So yeah.
I think it would be maybe before we continue, and I see a lot of people writing here that by all means continue if you have the patience with us. But I think it would be good for us to hear a little bit about these two collections and sort of why and how we have these the collections that you're referring to today, the Fitzwilliam Virginal Book and the Lady Nevell, if possible.
Yeah, it's not. There is not much I can say because there is not much one knows. Lady Nevell's book is a collection of exclusively compositions by William Byrd, and there are some corrections in the manuscript of which one is quite sure that they are in Byrd's handwriting, but one doesn't have enough examples of Byrd's handwriting to be 100% sure. So, but it seems to have been copied, as I said, in his presence, so to say. Fitzwilliam is a completely different thing. It's a compilation of many composers. It's the largest overview of music, virginal music, compiled, written in the 1620s when poor Mr. Trajan was in prison. It contains an awful lot of music by many composers. As I said, as the quality of the sources are inferior, but it's like 5 times as large. It's one of the largest collections of keyboard music assembled. One doesn't know much about it's even some scholars seem to think maybe Trajan was not the one who copied it, but it's nothing is really sure. I mean, it's a long time ago. We will never know about certain details.
And there's another question that we have. Could you share your thoughts? This is from Georgios Dragos. Could you share your thoughts on the aesthetic and cultural affinities between the music of the Virginalists and the Elizabethan drama?
I'm not an Elizabethan drama specialist. Obviously, music was used. The typically English form of masks or things are music was part of the drama, but I'm not a competent person to answer that. Interestingly enough, there is Ophelia in Hamlet is when she gets crazy just before she dies, she sings a few lines of Walsingham, Shakespeare writes. So there are, whatever that means, crazy, if maybe she was also a secret Catholic or what, we don't know which melody she sang. There are a few connections. I mean, also there is a sonnet, but I don't remember which one by Shakespeare, which clearly associates, I can't quote it, it's too long ago, I read it somewhere. It's about the ruin of a church, and the birds sing in the ruin. And the bird, of course, is maybe a human bird and not a bird. So there is a pun in one of his Shakespeare songs playing.
I think it's, I have found it, which I can post for all of us to read, and he does refer to the bare ruined choirs where late the sweet sing.
Yeah. Obviously, Byrd was a very famous man in England, and not only in England, but there is no doubt that Shakespeare and Byrd knew each other.
Well, if you have the patience, I think it would be wonderful to see the other pieces that you meant to share, but we don't want to exhaust you too much.
No, I mean, yes, let's be superficial and quick. First, I have to search them myself. So now let's have a quick look at Don't Come Kiss Me Now. Really quick. Exactly. Thank you. what should we? Well, I will just say very few words. Again, very simple, popular tune. Passamezzo Moderno is the harmonic model that came from Italy. Like it's a harmonic sequence or a bass progression like La Follia. And Passamezzo Moderno is what we would in modern terms call tonic, subdominant, tonic, dominant, tonic, and then the following chord is sort of can be different. Here we see, so I speak about the second harmony of the third bar. That could be either F major, as Byrd harmonizes it here. It could also be D major. It could be A minor. So that is somehow can be treated in different ways. All the rest is perfectly clear. Afterwards, there's a cadence in G. So that model you have in many, many Italian pieces. Mentioning now Italy, of course, as already speaking only about Byrd, it gets much too long. I don't want to give the impression that Byrd was the only genius in his time and living on a deserted island. So there is a lot of connection, especially between Italy and of course between France. It's not that he lived in a vacuum. In my personal opinion, he is the greatest of his generation by a large margin. So, but I have to leave out all the context. Just only now that I mentioned Passamezzo Moderno, the harmonic structure of the theme, of course that comes from Italy, as many other things came from Italy. You here it's a very it's a very clever piece. The way he derives his counterpoints from this very simple melody, I will not go into detail. I will just sort of no, I will not. I will just shut up. You have again sort of two waves. You have an amazing variety of elements, sometimes changing counterpoint and each bar of the theme. Like if to give you just one example, variation 7, which is again the calm, the tranquil center of the piece. First bar, counterpoint going downwards, second bar, counterpoint going upwards, then third bar, syncopation, fourth bar, also syncopation, but in a different way. So you have this incredible speed of events. Someone made a comparison to Beethoven and motivic work. Motivic work is as old as music, motivic elaboration, although Beethoven was especially strong, so was Byrd. So another comparison maybe between Byrd and Beethoven, in spite of all their stylistic differences, is that sometimes there's an amazing speed of events. Byrd's music can happen, and I don't speak of the speed of the note values, but of the speed of events can happen extremely fast in a way which sometimes, I mean, certain Mozart opera finales have an amazing speed of musical events, not only events on stage, and some of Beethoven's pieces also have an amazing speed. Byrd surely the same. What you can also see, roughly similar to Walsingham, in the second wave of acceleration, you have a triplet, so you have the fastest note values right before the final variation, which is again like waltzing, the final two variations. So again, we have a calm section at the end. That is not only Byrd's style. In Renaissance music, you didn't end with the fastest variation, the way a Handel chaconne would end with the fastest figurations. You always had to round it off with something, bringing it back to a certain calmness. And here again, and if we look just in the variation 16, the very last one, we have a beautiful, beautiful soprano superimposed over the actual melody, which is in the alto, exactly the same he did in Walsingham. And also it has a sort of, my association is always it comes right from heaven, out of heaven. There is an angel smiling at us and adding a higher soprano above what had been the highest voice before. It's a pity, but I think I will not go into much more detail. This piece is in time duration fairly short. I don't think it's much more than 5.5 minutes. It has a richness in detail, especially the way he starts to design and plan and develop one counterpoint out of the preceding one, developing into the next one, which is amazing. He was he was a true genius. So this is maybe I will only say this. And speaking of rhythmic, we had the question of rhythmic variety and triplets against duolen. And maybe I will only show you the rhythmical crazy things which happen in the Fantasia, to give you an idea what somehow about the rhythmical richness and inventiveness he can have. And again, to not put him too much into a vacuum, very much in general, one can see that the rhythmical sophistication of Renaissance music is actually much higher than the rhythmical variety in the 17th and 18th century. It became very much standardized because one was more and more somehow either obsessed with harmony or obsessed with a certain polyphony, which, like in the case of Bach, ended up in complementary rhythm, a continuous flow of eighth notes. That's no criticism of Bach, but it's just the way his polyphony works. And the Renaissance polyphony is capable of superimposing metrical structures which makes us think, oh, how avant-garde, but actually it's conservative. Byrd was in that conservative that he was rhythmically much more inventive than even the composers of one generation later, which are much more somehow even and square and stereotyped already. So in this Fantasia, I will just briefly tell you, Fantasia in this time is a title which can mean all sorts of different things. There are completely from beginning to end polyphonic fantasias, and there are fantasias which are capricci of very different things which can happen. They all usually begin in a polyphonic way, exactly like it does here. You have the theme, and then if we go to the and it's a piece I forgot to mention. Fantasia is a piece in sections, like a motet. A motet in choral music introduces new themes with new text phrases. Each text phrase gets its own motive, and good composers somehow make them sound at the same time new, but somehow not completely unrelated to what was going on before. So we have a motet structure. The first theme is obviously in bar 1. The second theme is the last bar of the third line. And if we turn the page, then we have the polyphonic beginning is abandoned, and it gets more, it looks already on paper, it starts to develop in a true keyboard virtuose style, like in a toccata. If you see third line of page, of the left page here. This is a typical toccata motif. Then we have some chordal passages in between to separate sections. On top of the next page, or the last two bars of that page 190. And could you please turn the pages? It's good to have two pages at once. Then we have like a sort of, again, toccata style, the beginning of that page, 191, like an Italian toccata, looks like Italian music, or like a recitativo free. Then we have the last bar of that same line suddenly starts looking like dance music. And then, this is what I just wanted to show you because I find it absolutely delightful. Then, approximately at the, it's not, there is no clear separation of section. Approximately second bar of second line from the bottom of page 191. Yeah, that line exactly. Or go to the second and third bar. Then he starts playing around with syncopations. Interesting, we think, yes. And then one end of that line exactly go to the last two bars, again syncopations. But if we look closely, or if you play it for yourself, you start discovering actually it's not syncopations, it's polyrhythmic. The scribe, this is Fitzwilliam Virginal Book, so the scribe is not handling it very clearly. He doesn't change the metrical designation, but what happens is actually here we are no longer in a bar of 4, the way it looks, but the left hand in that bar exactly is in 3/2, whereas the right hand is in 3/8. So he superimposes without changing the speed of the eighth notes or the half notes, the speed. I mean, with all freedom Fantasia allows, but the basic speed is left unchanged. But suddenly we have 3/2. One element, usually in the left hand, is in 3/2. You can see it very clearly, second bar of the following page, exactly 192, second bar. You see 3 half notes, and on top you see over 3 half notes, you have 4 bars of 3/8. So it's a 12/8 against 3/2 polyrhythm. And then it gets even more crazy when he starts dotting the fast tripla, second line, second bar, against da, di, dum, bi. So absolutely delightful, but this is not the end of what he gives us as rhythmical extravagance. So this is followed by, again, the normal bar in 4 is exactly there again. And now can you, then if there is a, speaking of a pasticcio of a form which is developed spontaneously, after exactly where the cursor is, it sounds again like toccata, one line below, it sounds again like a dance. And actually this dance is also tricky because if you look at the right hand, you can again divide it. You can see it, maybe it's again 3 times, no, 3/8, 3/8, 2/8. Let's see what happens afterwards, because this is premonition of things to come. So then we have a normal tripla, which we know in so many pieces, where number 3 is the section number 3. We have the normal tripla relation, that what was 2 half notes before, so second line, exactly. What was 2 half notes before is now 2 dotted half notes, the same duration. So it's a triolic triple relationship. But then he goes one step further. If we now look at the following page, where following page, second line, exactly. So we are in the tripla, and towards the beginning of the tripla is completely normal. We have the normal distribution. The dotted, as I said, dotted half notes is as long as half note before. So we have 2, so to say, twice 3, 4 per bar. Da 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 dee da da dee da da dee. And then towards the end, there is ever stronger and stronger a hemiolic element in the left hand. And then we have another tripla on top of the tripla. The 1 half note of the hemiola of the last bar of that 6/4 section, 1 half note, second line again of bar of page 194. Exactly. So that transition is going from 6/4 to 9/4. So the hemiolic half note of the previous bar before the change of tempo equals again a dotted half note afterwards. And then we have this lovely polyrhythm, which it takes a while to calculate. You have a dualic bass, 2 notes, which the way they are written here, those 2 notes take, each of them takes as long as a simple half note in the bar before. And on top you have 9/4, so 9 quarter notes. And then he speeds it up further, as you can see, end of this page, in 8th notes, which is really very fast, because already the quarter notes in 9/4 are faster than the 8th notes of the initial tempo, because we are in double tripla. And you have to play it yourself. The way he does the transitions are hilarious. This is like a car crash. I find the transition towards the 9/4 is like an accident set into music. So turn page, please. And then we see towards the very end, we are suddenly, of course, back to just for the last chord, tonic and subdominant tonic, a plagal cadence. We are back to the initial measure of 4. So this piece, it starts like a very serious, like a choral piece, and develops into something which is close to a car accident. You could, if this made you a little bit curious, I would recommend very much one piece of chamber music, so you can also see what he was like in chamber music. My favorite gamba consort. It might be gamba, 5 gambas, or it might be maybe also recorders, but it's 5 parts. Structured similar to Walsingham, and the title of the piece is, it has 2 titles. In some sources it is called The Leaves Be Green, in other sources it is called Browning. And you find the score in Petrucci library, so it's easy to find. I think you can give enter either in Petrucci, you will find it. Browning or The Leaves Be Green by But you have the most delightful polyrhythmic constellations there. And of course, if you're writing for 5 instruments, you can allow for even more. complications than for two hands on a keyboard. Yes.
I won't be fair if we don't summarize the questions, because there are several questions from.
Yes, I'm finished now. Now it's only for questions.
A few colleagues are asking a similar thing. As far as one of the questions is, as far as concerning articulation, what would be for this style an equivalent to the recommendations of C.P. Bach? Another student says, which recording suggestions would you have for tasteful ornamentations, and how would you execute the style on the modern instrument? And lastly, another one of our colleagues asks similarly, bearing, or to this in the same vein, bearing in mind that this is generally contrapuntal music and textures can be quite thick, what is the role of added diminutions and ornaments in this music? So I think there is a lot of interest and concern as far as ornamentation, and some guidance as to where to start prying this rich topic from.
So let's start, as I'm an old man and my memory is sometimes a bit, I start with the last question, which I still remember. I can only say I don't understand the question exactly, because a rich counterpoint, yes, occasionally, not always, because as we see, especially in this fantasy, he is capable of writing extremely rich counterpoint, but also purely homophonic music. Regardless of if it's polyphonic or if it's homophonic, ornamenting doesn't really have, I don't know, of course it's influenced by texture, but it doesn't mean polyphonic music should not be ornamented. You can see that very clearly in many polyphonic pieces of him. Some of them, it's not much different from Bach. We have some pieces which just by chance are preserved in versions which are highly ornamented, and you have other pieces which just by chance are preserved in versions which don't carry a single ornament. It's quite the same in William Byrd, but there is no relationship between if it's the more polyphonic, the less one should ornament. Of course, if you have 5 fingers on the keyboard, it limits, purely technically speaking, your possibilities of ornamentation. That is for sure. But maybe I misunderstood the question.
No, I think this seems to me what was asked. We will hear an objection if it wasn't. But I think the question of partly, I think you answered the question of ornaments and some place for, let's say, people that are newer to this style, as to how can one go about it. And I posted the article that you mentioned, but are there some others that you would point the people to?
Still speaking about ornamentation.
Yes, I think so. I think there seems to be quite a lot of interest about this.
Well, that is really obviously Philipp Emanuel Bach doesn't apply at all, because
no, I think the question was whether there's an equivalent of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach for Renaissance music.
Maybe the closest. It's sometimes taken, but it's the closest. It's not close at all. It's a generation older. Tomás de Santa Maria, the Spanish monk, who wrote a treatise on playing il clavicordio, he calls it, but it's all meant harpsichord. Like virginal is also just a name for harpsichord. And he has quite precise descriptions of ornamentations, like a trill, like a mordent. Of course, they are called differently, but this is not very close because it's a Spanish source, and there is no way to know if Byrd knew this source. It's only somehow remotely contemporary. And what you can see there is also another source regarding ornamentation is the famous treatise with compositional examples by Diego Ortiz, the Gamba treatise with Diminutions. He gives melodies and gives you possibilities to write diminutions on given melodies, and diminutions are, of course, ornaments. I think in very much as a general approach, I would repeat what I said. The signs might mean more, here's a good place to find an ornament, but it might be a melismatic ornament more than just trill or mordent or just Vorschlag, or it might also mean that. But so actually Ortiz is an interesting source because he was a very good musician, but Santa Maria was also a good musician. But both of them are Spanish. So.
And then we have one more question that has come in, maybe two more questions that are more specific to the pieces. One is from Mikhail Shilaev asking, what are the general principles of articulation, particularly in the long, fast passages? For instance, in John Come Kiss Me Now in variation 10, what impact do the fingering principles, for example, crossing fingers, should have on the articulation?
Yeah, that's... There are so many questions I cannot answer. So obviously we have, we know in general the fingering system. We have also pieces in the Fitzwilliam Virginal Book and in other sources. A few pieces have fingering. So we see that in England, the usual fingering for going up on the good note, the accentuated note 3, on the bad note 4. So you have this.
And do you use the thumb in this repertoire, or you would try not to use the thumb, or you don't have a particular religion on the thumb?
Of course, you use the thumb in chords, because without thumbs you cannot even play chords which are on octaves. That's clear. In runs, at the end of runs, of course, you play all the way down to the thumb. If it's a downward run in the right hand and the last note, yes, then there's the thumb. In the middle of a scale, it was not used. But Sancta Maria gives fingerings, and he gives as the main fingerings exactly this: 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, 4 for the right hand. Left hand, surprisingly, is different, but let's not get too much into detail. But he gives for very fast runs also the possibility 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. We do not see fingerings with 4 fingers in a row in the Fitzwilliam, but what do we know what Byrd did? The next thing, of course, I mean, this is as this was more thought of an appetizer, I didn't want to actually to speak much about the instrument question. Of course, a harpsichord not only sounds different, but has much smaller depth of key. This fingering is much more comfortable on a harpsichord than on a modern piano, because the depth is much shallower of the keys. On a modern piano, I think I don't want to turn you all into harpsichord players. I just want you to enjoy William Byrd's music if you play it with modern fingering on a modern piano. Anyway, it's not the right instrument, but it makes sense on a modern piano. I don't think it sounds any worse than Bach sounds on a modern piano, although Bach composed for a different instrument just as much as William Byrd. So I would not, if I'm talking to modern pianists, I wouldn't even start about fingerings, I have to say.
But also,
of course, it sounds different, but one part of the question was how much does it affect articulation? It depends actually if the keyboard is here. If you go up and you do body, dida, you get very clear articulations. If you turn the head, you can nearly play legato, but still it sounds, you still hear a sparkle of the, without even that there is rhythmical inequality. Somehow it sounds more lively around like this. But if what it means in articulation, of course, depends if you hold your hand like this or in going up like this, in going down like this. So difficult to say. But it surely sounds different from modern fingering. Yes, it does. Because of course, how couldn't it? You do very different things.
Yeah, well, I think you bring us also to the point that actually in our discussion when we were setting these seminars up, that you said that you would like to illustrate with this teaser and taster on William Byrd that keyboard music has not been on a historical trajectory upwards in terms of getting better from a long time ago until Rachmaninoff, but in some way also compositionally, I think what you've illustrated in terms of his strategies of motivic strategies and long-range planning, that history is much more a recurring pattern rather than a progression from not so sophisticated to sophisticated. And I think this is very clear from your talk.
Yeah, I mean, there is no, I guess, it's fairly clear, there is no progress in art. It's not that there's decline, but I think this music as keyboard music is in no way inferior to the best keyboard music of later centuries. It's like the opera. It was invented around 1600, and after 10 years, Monteverdi wrote Orfeo, and opera never got better than that. It got equally good in very different ways, but it's a bit similar to this. I mean, this is the very beginning of autonomous keyboard music, and it's not inferior to Bach or Beethoven. No, I don't think so. No.
Well, I think you illustrated very clearly.
My perception, at least.
Absolutely. So I think we probably, unless we have...
see you all tomorrow, or some of you are...
Yes, so for those of you that are still here, and I think that's pretty much almost everybody that we had at the start, tomorrow at 6 at the same time, we can hear Andreas talk about the Klavierübung of Bach, and particularly concentrating on the partitas, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions there. Try to have the music in front of you, but we'll have it also on the screen. If you haven't registered yet, you have the link to register for the next 2 seminars. I will...
Sorry, let me maybe just mention one point. As I have talked very much indeed today, as Bach is more known than Byrd, and then we go further to Beethoven, my talk hopefully will be a decrescendo. I will give, the way I see it tomorrow is I will give you hopefully not too long sketch of Klavierübung, the 4 parts of Klavierübung, which means the later part of Bach's keyboard works, and then rely much more on questions coming from you, because I suppose I don't have to, I will not analyze a partita because I take for granted that you know them somehow. So there will be maybe, who knows, 10, 15 minutes, not longer than 15 minutes, surely not, introduction to just outline some of the tracks of Bach's thinking in writing for keyboard, starting from about 1713 to his death. And the rest, I think, we can, I would encourage you to just ask questions. I think, so I can assure you I will not talk nearly as much as I did today.
Yes, thank you so much. Before everybody goes, I'm about to post in the chat a Dropbox link where I have put the scores that were discussed today, the poems that Andreas referenced, and I will save the chat transcript, which we had also some things I pasted also in that folder. So it's all going to be an Andreas Staier folder in Dropbox, and you can come to it later, and we'll add tomorrow the things that are relevant to Bach, and the next day to Beethoven. So unless there is something you want to say, Andreas, we will thank you, and we will see you tomorrow.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.